My father spent 14 years locked behind the thick steel doors of the Barry Telford State Penitentiary located right outside Texarkana, Texas. Recently I took an interest in the darker events that have happened to various family members, and sat down to ask him if he had any chilling stories or experiences he could share about his time he spent incarcerated, anything that he hadn't shared with me before. I was both pleased and horrified as for the next 2 hours he divulged some truly chilling and grotesque tales. I will just let you know now that some of these stories are graphic, and if you have a weak stomach I'd advise you not to read further. For the rest of you, I won't sparse details and I'll lay them out exactly as he laid them out to me. My dad was sent to the Telford unit, a few months after his 21st birthday, sentenced to 20 years for armed robbery. It is a maximum security prison designed to mostly hold suspected gang members and violent criminals. The first day is a total shock to your system. You are stripped and cavity searched, coming in and out of every room, you have a bedtime, you are timed at meals, and thrown into a cell with 3 other inmates telling you the house rules and which bunk is yours. Then laying in bed that first night, that's when it hits you that this is home, that this is your life now. Out of anything I can recall, that feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, that loss of freedom, that's the scariest part of prison. He told me that as the months pass you get used to your routine, you start to need this structure, even crave it. He said he decided to make the best of it, learn as many skills as he could, and stay as busy as possible. One of his vocational skills he picked up was plumbing, and soon became the in-house plumber for Building A. Now the way the prison is set up is that there is an A building and a B building. Inside each building there are 10 cell houses, each cell house contains 12 cells that can hold anywhere from 1 to 4 inmates each. In the middle of each cell house is the rec room where the cells all open up to, and this is where the inmates spend most of their free time. In addition to the cell houses, each building also contains several solitary wings, labeled from Alpha to Zulu. When I first got there, everyone kept joking that if I stepped out of line the guards would send me to Mike's egg. One day I asked a buddy, who had been locked up for 15 years already when I got there, why people kept talking about Mike's egg and not any of the other seg wings. Look, his buddy told him, people who have extended stays in Mike just don't come back the same, some don't come back at all. The guards know it, that's why they always fill Mike last, or put new guys there who they think might be troublemakers. At night in Mike and you'll straighten your act up real quick. I've never been there myself, but I talked to a couple inmates who have and they both told me the same thing, something evil lives in that place. So like I said, my dad had become the on-call plumber for Building A. He said it was about 6 months into the job when he had his first encounter with Mike's egg. Whenever a toilet was stopped up or something was leaking, the guards would just knock on my door and lead me to the problem. It was an around-the-clock type of thing, I didn't mind though, any excuse to get out of the cell was fine by me. Plus you get your own cell since you'd be coming in and out at all hours of the night and day, so that was a nice perk as well. Anyway, one night there's a knock on my door and the guard tell me to get dressed, Rashell, we need you in seg. I get up, the guard opens my door and we start heading down to seg. It's a real mess down there, I've seen a lot of shit in my day but this is crazy. The guard told my dad as he led him down the connecting corridors, just make sure you wear your gloves and booties, Rashell. My dad was curious and asked the guard what had happened. Looney Tune on suicide watch, I guess somehow must have snuck in a piece of metal. Look, I shouldn't tell you this but I don't want you to be surprised when you get in there. Crazy cut off his own genitals. He threw his testicles out on the run, but we can't find his penis, and that's where you come in. When they reached their destination there was another guard standing outside with an inmate holding a mop waiting to clean up after my dad was finished. My dad said when they opened the door to IMSEG it was almost hauntingly dark, 4 or 5 dim overhead lights ran down the hallway but seemed to act more like spotlights and gave off practically no ambient light. He said there was a trail of blood leading towards the back of the corridor. Each seg block had 14 cells with solid steel doors. Each door had a small window that could be opened and closed from the outside and a tracelet which the guy must have used to toss his testicles out. As he got closer he could see that blood was running out from a cell towards the end of the block through a small gap under the door. Open 13, the guard yelled to another guard behind a glass window controlling the electronic locks. When I went into that cell I couldn't believe how much blood there was. It was on the walls and the ceiling, the entire mattress pad was doused in it. The toilet was flooded up to the brim and it looked like it was filled with blood. I used a cup to transfer the bloody water into buckets until I could start to see the silhouette of something under the water. I could see a big wad of toilet paper, so I pulled it out and sat it on the floor. I could tell something was inside it. As I started to slowly unravel the wad, all of a sudden I started hearing this noise coming from the air vents: thunk, thunk, thunk. It sounded like someone crawling or trying to sneak through them almost. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I'll get back to that later. Anyway, I unrolled the paper and sure enough the guy's Becker was right there. The guard took it and dropped it in a bag of ice, and after making sure the toilet flushed, he started leading my dad back to the entrance of Mike's Egg. When we got down the hall waiting for the exit door to open, all the lights went out. "Shit," muttered the guard, "against the wall and meet." I stood back against the wall, my dad continued, and as the guards tried to figure out what was going on, I heard that noise in the vents again. It was coming from the cell I'd just come out of. Thunk, thunk, thunk. I didn't know what it was, but it gave me this awful feeling, and as I was standing there I realized it was getting louder and faster and closer to me. Thunk, 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 thunk. It sounded like whatever was in that vent was now in a dead sprint right at us. The guard was trying to ignore it, but I could tell he heard it too, because he kept looking back over his shoulder and started yelling at the guard behind the glass. "Hey! Hey! Thunk, 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 hurry up and get this fucking door open! Thunk, thunk, thunk!" Just as the noise in the vent got up to us, the lights came back on and it went silent. The door opened up and the guard got us out of there as fast as he could. A few days later I saw the inmate who was waiting on janitor duty that night and asked him if he had seen anything. He told me he saw them wheel a guy covered in blood out on a stretcher, and that he was screaming about a man in the vents and that the man had told him to do it. My dad also asked him if he had heard anything in the vents while he was mopping up, but he told my dad he didn't hear anything, but that he found the metal the man from 13 had used to cut himself. It was buried in a pool of blood, the guy said. Damn, this thing too looked like a piece of shrapnel cut out from air duct metal. The next story my dad shared with me is more graphic and scary in the sense of what human beings are capable of. We get new guys that think they are going to be badasses all the time. Sometimes it works out for them and other times it doesn't. There were lots of serious gangs in BTU, and sometimes you get a guy who comes in from a local street gang that doesn't really comprehend how violent some of these big gangs are. It's like they are playing gang to look cool, like kids play cops and robbers. The problem is that they think other people are just playing gang too or something. Anyway, we had this one guy, Ricky, come in and everyone but him knew it was going to end badly for him. He was this young Hispanic guy, and he thought his small town gang was a direct rival to another Hispanic gang, MS-13. He would curse out and disrespect them in front of everyone at chat time, and in the halls, and scream at their members who'd pass his cell. He'd only been there a week. Some of the elders tried telling him he needed to calm down before he got hurt, but Ricky was hard-headed and just wouldn't hear it. Well, one day during dinner the chow hall was quiet and Ricky was nowhere to be seen. My table was dismissed first, and as we made our way back to our cell house we turned the corner to see Ricky covered in blood stumbling towards us, arms wrapped around his stomach. He was completely naked, big patches of his skin cut from his body where his tattoos had been. Both of his eyes were popped out from their sockets and were just dangling towards the ground. The side of his head was caved in where they had stomped his skull until his eyes came out. As he came closer I could see he was holding his intestines in his hands. The worst part to me is that he hadn't died during it, that he was conscious for every blow and every cut. He just hobbled up the hall in our directions crying and asking, "Why can't I look up? Why can't I look up?" He collapsed and passed out a few seconds later, and died right there at our feet. They never found out who did it. Alright, I'll share one more story my dad shared with me I found kind of creepy, as this is getting pretty long. About 7 years into his stint in prison my dad said through a series of circumstances he ended up having to stay the night in MSEG. The A building was being renovated and repaired, and as a result they were sending the inmates to stay in SEG in waves. Well, it had been years since my dad had been to the rarely used MSEG, and he had convinced himself that he was just hearing things that night. They were leading prisoners out one cell at a time and transferring them to the various SEG blocks. My dad's cell was on the end and he had his cell to himself, so when they transferred him he wasn't accompanied by any other inmates. To his dismay, of all the SEG blocks had been filled, except for him, that is. They let him down to the end of them and opened the door to 14, which was right next to the cell the man had cut himself in all those years ago. Everything was fine until lights out. It was really dark in there. Each cell has a little nightlight thing above the toilet, but it's not enough to see anything or read or write. Anyway, it was so dark I figured the only thing I could do was go to sleep. But all night I kept hearing the guy in the cell next to me talking to himself. The way the cells are set up, the vents carry any little noise to the adjoining cells. The vents themselves are located right at the foot of the little cots in each cell. People would sit next to them to communicate, and pass time during stints in solitary, but this guy wasn't talking to me, he was like he was talking to himself, and it was starting to really wear on my nerves. I banged on the vent and told him to keep it down, but he just kept talking in this whispery voice, and it sounded like he was chanting the same thing over and over, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I put my ear up to the vent, to try and see what he was saying, and my hair stood up on the back of my head, when I swear God I felt his breath in my ear as clear as day. I heard him whispering, "I remember you, I remember you, I remember you," in this frantic melodic tune. "Well, you won't remember anything when I bash your head, and if you don't keep it down in there," I told him. All of a sudden his voice got a little louder and angrier in tone. "I'll slit your throat, I'll slit your throat, I'll slit your throat." I was a little unnerved, but I've heard a lot worse after so many years in prison, so I just told him to fuck off and decided I'd let the guards deal with it in the morning. Well, morning came, and when the guard brought me my breakfast, I told him if he didn't do something about the guy keeping me up all night and 13 that I would. "What are you talking about, Rashell? You're the only person in MSEG," the guard told me as chills ran down my spine. That night, as soon as the light went out, the whispers started again, and this time I was petrified. "I'll slit your throat, I'll slit your throat, I'll slit your throat." The whispers were more aggressive this time, clearer too. Then all of a sudden they went from whispers to deep guttural screams. "I'll slit your throat, I'll slit your throat, I'll slit your fucking throat." It scared me so bad I fell out of my cot and scooted on the floor until I felt my back hit the wall opposing the air vent. As my eyes came into focus in absolute horror, I saw the silhouette of a head directly inside the vent. I couldn't make out its features, but I see its eyes. They were full of hatred and rage, and they were locked right into me. Fast and louder he just continued screaming that he'd slit my throat, as the vent casing started to shake. Now the vents go straight up in a duct to a main duct, then back down to the next cell through another duct, so you can see into your neighbor's cell from your cell. That meant whatever this thing was, it was right inside my vent. I jumped up and banged on the steel door as hard as I could, telling for a guard. "Help! Help! Somebody!" A guard came running down the hall, and as soon as he slid the door window open, the vent went silent. "You gotta get me out of here, something is in the vents," I pleaded. To my surprise, the guard didn't protest my request. Instead, he just told me to hang tight for a second and then clicked his radio and said, "Need an open cell for a transfer from MSEG." He paused for a second, then leaned back into his radio and simply said, "He's back." He opened the door and led me down the corridor, and as they did the whole time, we were followed by that familiar sound in the vents. Thunk, thunk, thunk. I've seen and heard a lot in my years, not a lot gets under my skin, but I was shaking like a leaf the whole way out of MSEG. I don't think I took a breath until I walked out the blocked doors and heard them shut behind me. I finally worked up the nerve to ask that guard what the hell was in those vents. "I don't know, Rashell. Warden will tell you there's nothing in those vents. All I can tell you is that whatever it is, it's evil." If you like this story, smash the like button, and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you want to be notified on the latest videos, hit that notification bell.